Hello everyone and welcome. In this video we are going to be taking a look at one of the first server-side vulnerabilities, arguably the most important or most prevalent as it features individually in the OWASP top 10, and that is server-side request forgery. So the idea here is to get an introduction to SSRF, understand what it is, how it works, what's possible through successful exploitation, etc., etc. And then throughout this particular section, the SSRF section, we're going to be taking a look at various examples ranging from, the most basic to quite an advanced example. But with that being said, let's get started. What is server-side request forgery, or SSRF? Well, SSRF is a vulnerability that allows an attacker to trick a server, that's the key word there, into making unauthorized requests to internal or external resources on its behalf. These requests are initiated by the vulnerable application, that's the key thing to note there, but controlled by the attacker, often leading to exposure of sensitive data or access to restricted systems. And what does this all mean from your perspective, or from the perspective of an attacker? Well, successful exploitation typically or often leads to, sensitive data disclosure, theft of authentication information. That's a bit of a, bespoke outcome, but, hopefully by the end of this section of the course, that'll become clear. Internal network reconnaissance, so the ability to essentially, I would say this is more of an identification or POC technique where you try and assess whether the application can communicate with systems internally. So sort of ping or check a particular port of a system within the network in which the web application is operating. Or, if it's in a cloud environment, you can try and perform some network discovery to see what other IPs you can you sort of have access to via the the application itself, or the application server itself. And then of course you have a remote code execution, and what I mean by this is SSRF can be used, or is typically used, as an entry point for more advanced attacks like RCE or even privilege escalation. And then of course you also have your standard file read or inclusion vulnerabilities, or that's pretty much what you can get. And again, for now, there's quite a bit, and if you read any of the guides online, or some of the bug bounty reports, they sort of encapsulate or all deal with various types of vulnerabilities, or I should say impact various types of SSRF exploitation techniques, and also the outcomes. And that's something that's quite important. No SSRF vulnerability is going to be the same in terms of what you actually get to access after successful exploitation. So what causes SSRF? Well, SSRF vulnerabilities are typically caused by unvalidated input, obviously. So applications accept user-supplied URLs or resources without properly validating or sanitizing them. And then, of course, you have server trust. So the server has access to the resources not directly available to the attacker. And if you remember what we've covered thus far, this is quite important. And what am I referring to here? Well, internal APIs, databases, or cloud metadata services. The only difference is you're not, like an injection attack, you're not utilizing the injection attack, or you're not utilizing SSRF, to directly access a database. SSRF takes advantage of that server trust, right? And as a result of that, you can do quite a few things, but again, it's going to be entirely dependent on the application you're testing and what's accessible. And then of course, improper access control. So applications do not enforce strict policies to prevent unauthorized or unintended requests to, and this is quite important, to, let's say, specific files. There may be no limitation to using specific functions, like for example the file read function in PHP that allows you to read files on the actual server itself, which can be dangerous. And some examples of vulnerable scenarios, or some examples of SSRF vulnerabilities found in web applications would include image fetchers or URL preview generators that download content from user-supplied URLs, usually quite quite interesting to see that, or, it's quite prevalent, I should say. And also another example where, API integrations where the server processes the user input as part of an external request. So those are the causes. And now I think, to better understand SSRF, it's probably a good idea to take a look at the anatomy of an SSRF attack, or to, understand exactly what happens, when it happens, etc. So, firstly, you as the pen tester or an attacker would identify a vulnerable endpoint. So look for functionality where the application fetches resources or content from a user provided URL. So you're not looking just for any, user input. You're looking for areas where a URL, the user can supply a URL. It doesn't have to be direct, but the typical examples are, downloaders. So if you've ever seen websites that allow you to download a YouTube video where you provide the URL of the YouTube video, that's an example. I'm not saying target those web applications. I'm just trying to give you an idea of what I'm talking about. The other common one are webhooks or API testers. Secondly, manipulate the input. So craft a malicious URL that points to an internal or unauthorized resource, such as internal servers. So you could essentially try and see if you can, perform a ping or try and connect to localhost or 127.0.0.1. And again, if the web app is being hosted within a larger cloud infrastructure, you can try and, access cloud metadata endpoints, for example, the following IP on AWS, just to see what happens. And then, of course, step 3, the server processes the request. So the application server processes the attacker-controlled URL and executes the request. And the server's trust in its network allows access to otherwise restricted resources. So hopefully what I explained in the previous video and also what we talked about here when we talk about server trust is starting to make sense. And then step 4, extract or exploit the response. So the attacker may retrieve sensitive information, for example, internal service data, credentials, and in advanced cases, the attacker may use SSRF to perform port scanning on internal systems, chain attacks with other vulnerabilities, so for example, deserialization or remote code execution. So fairly simple in terms of the anatomy. This is what it looks like. You have the attacker here. So you send a crafted request, then the vulnerable application. This is this is what you would call the application server layer. And then, of course, you also have the internal services or, potential targets like the internal file server, internal APIs, cloud metadata. But the bottom line is that, the vulnerable application processes the malicious input. So, you can just, think of this as the internal server responds with the sensitive data. And again, these can all be possible or potential targets, but it's fairly simple to understand. So that brings us to another important point, and that is, what are the various types of SSRF attacks? Because this is something you may again have come across previously. So the first is obviously what is colloquially called the basic SSRF, where the attacker utilizes a malicious URL to fetch internal resources or external data via the server. Examples of this are, for example, the URL here, http example.com fetch, the parameter URL is equal to, in this case, let's say the web application allows you to load an external PNG. But as the attacker, you modify it to point to your own, the attacker controlled server where you're hosting whatever. It could be a payload or anything like that. The bottom line is you're just trying to leverage the functionality of the web application in relation to how it essentially utilizes or how it reaches out to external or even internal services or servers, if you will. And as a result of that, you're able to verify whether, yes, an SSRF vulnerability does exist or, it doesn't exist. And then, of course, you have your blind SSRF, which sort of follows your testing that you would perform for basic, where the attacker, similar to blind SQL injection, the attacker, cannot directly see the server's response, but can infer results through through the side effects. So, for example, server logs or DNS resolution. So, in the advanced injection attacks course, if you remember when we're talking about out-of-band SQL injection and sort of utilizing or making the database make external calls to a DNS server and then monitoring the DNS server logs to see whether the target web application or target application server is actually, or database, I should say, is actually reaching out to our server. So, the example here is exactly that. So you send a DNS query to a control domain. So you have http example.com fetch parameter URL is equal to what the application expects to be legitimate, but in this case you just point it to the attacker control domain, and you monitor as the attacker or pen tester the DNS logs to see whether you're getting any interesting requests from the target web application. And then of course you have SSRF to internal reconnaissance. This is not really a vulnerability, but more so, it is a type of SSRF vulnerability. The only difference is this is very specific in that you try and test to see whether the SSRF vulnerability allows you to scan internal networks or services that are not exposed externally. So, for example, testing for open ports on the actual local host, on the actual server where the web application is hosted. And you, as a POC, you generally try and see if you can access the web application itself that is, being hosted on the web server. So, port 80, port 443, etc. And then, of course, you have the advanced types of SSRF vulnerabilities that involve chaining, where SSRF is not the end goal, but part of a larger exploit. So SSRF is combined with other vulnerabilities for advanced exploitation. So, for example, in the case of cloud exploitation, you access cloud metadata services, for example, AWS IAM credentials via, the following sample URL, so latest metadata, etc. And then, of course, privilege escalation. So you access sensitive internal services that lead to privilege escalation or lateral movement. All right, so with that being said, that's an intro to SSRF. In the next video, we're going to be taking a look at exactly what an SSRF attack looks like through a very basic web application, and that will then be followed up by sort of a real-world practical example, quite advanced, that you will be able to play through yourself. But with that being said, that's going to be it for this video, and I will be seeing you in the next video.